Okay, so I'm going to kick us off now. So good afternoon and a warm welcome from a very sunny Cambridge. So welcome to our BioWednesday webinar on the topic of ESG and life science investment. So on behalf of One Nucleus, I'm delighted to be welcoming everyone to the session today. And also it's just over a year since we started hosting the BioWednesday webinars online. And so it's brilliant to see that they've been working so well and continue to do so. So the topic that we're discussing today is going to focus on the growing importance of sustainability and ESG factors on investor decision making. So I guess besides the most obvious, which is the beneficial impact that healthcare has on well-being, I'm really looking forward to hearing our panelists' views on what ESG factors they think are important. And for attendees listening in, I hope it can help help you to navigate these factors and to understand their increasing importance to investors as well. So just before we begin, I'm going to just go over a few housekeeping as we usually do. So we are recording, as you'll see, and the aim is that I will distribute the recording post-event. So the great news is if you miss any of the conversation and you want to revisit, then you can do so. And then also the chat box is enabled. So please do use the chat box to drop your comments and your questions, your thoughts, anything you want to share with the panelists and with attendees. And don't be shy, and we'll reserve some time after the panel discussion to pick up your questions. And also very happy to invite attendees to unmute as well, so we can make it an interactive session too. So I'm now going to hand over to Holly's capable hands. So Holly from Optimum Strategic Communications, who's going to be our moderator for today's session. So thank you, Holly, and thanks to all the panelists who will shortly do an introduction to themselves as well. So over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So yeah, to start, I was just going to ask each panelist to give a brief introduction to themselves, and then I'll kick off with questions. Shall we start with Paul?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Major. I'm a portfolio manager at Bellevue Asset Management in London, and I run a healthcare investment fund, which is predominantly focused on, in healthcare terms at least, sort of small and mid-cap healthcare companies.
Claire?
Hi folks, I'm Claire Thompson. I'm Chief Exec of Agility Life Sciences. We're an award-winning CDMO consulting and communications company. So we help our clients to turn their ideas into products. There's no point in having a great idea if you can't get money behind it. So we position them for investment and for growth. And probably the most important thing that we do is we help them to tell their story. Because as scientists, we're not always so good at that.
And Lindsay?
Afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here. I'm Lindsay Stewart. I'm joining from KPMG, where I'm the Senior Investor Engagement Manager in audit. What my role involves is speaking to investors and companies and trying to figure out what the ways forward are for financial reporting, audits and stewardship. In UK PLC, I very much have a listed company focus, and I've done quite a bit of work with large cap pharma companies over the years. So some of my answers will be very much through that lens. So it'd be interesting to hear if there are any other perspectives from adjacent sectors, such as, medical devices or diagnostics and things like that.
Thanks. And Jason?
Yeah, hi, I'm Jason Snape. I'm the Global Head of Environment within AstraZeneca. So I sit within the Global Sustainability team, and I have accountability for our greenhouse gas or climate strategy, our wastewater reduction, everything we're doing on product environmental stewardship and pharmaceuticals in the environment. I also represent AstraZeneca for environmental issues, actually a number of the ESG investor roadshows that we undertake.
Thanks, and lastly, Alice.
Hey everybody, Alice Pomponio, greeting from stateside. So I'm Managing Director of Bright Edge, which is American Cancer Society's impact investment arm. So we invest alongside traditional VCs in early stage oncology, biotech, and startup companies. But as you know, American Cancer Society is the largest cancer charity here in the US. Not only are we a heavy investor in early stage cancer research, but we also provide critical social safety net functions for cancer patients undergoing care. And so the concept behind BrightEdge is really to conquer cancer through patient-centric innovation while building resilience for the society and overall healthcare sustainability. Great to be here.
Perfect, thanks everybody. So to kick off with a general overview, perhaps we'll start with you, Lindsay. But so what is ESG? What are the key components of ESG for life science companies, and what are the opportunities and challenges?
Thank you, Ollie. So ESG is the phrase that you just can't escape in the investor world at the moment. For those that don't know, probably almost redundant for me to say, but ESG stands for the environmental, social, and governance factors that affect companies. And the key components of ESG for life science companies, it's very interesting to look at the life sciences sector versus other sectors, because quite a lot of companies, listed companies that I speak to, hear ESG and think climate. And there are very, very good reasons for that. Climate is incredibly important. However, and I'm going to refer to the work of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which has put together a framework of investor-focused and sector-specific disclosures that companies can use to communicate their ESG impact. They've looked at for example, the biotech and pharma sector and analysed which topics are most material for that sector. And it's interesting to see that out of the 6 general categories in the environment, such as GHG emissions, air quality, water management, etc., none of those 6 categories are actually material for the biotech and pharma sector. In my opinion, biotech and pharma is one of the most exposed sectors, not necessarily on the environment side, but on the social side. And we're definitely seeing that as we're living in the middle of a pandemic, that is the area where they have the most impact. So the things that SASB in particular would like companies to report on that investors have been asking about are issues like human rights and community relations, access and affordability, product quality and safety, what else? Human capital issues, particularly sort of the employee engagement side, the diversity and inclusion side, which has really risen up the agenda for investors in the last year. And we're seeing that come through at company meetings and AGMs. Business ethics is another one that comes up fairly frequently. The life sciences sector has a very large global footprint for many of the largest companies, and questions are asked on when they deal with what we call politically exposed persons, which they frequently have to, because essentially the buyers of healthcare are usually governments, and there are other considerations that come in there. So yes, hugely exposed on the social side, and not so much on environment, as important as that is to the world.
Anything to add, anybody?
Yeah, I can come in on that. From a small business perspective, the ESG, especially the environment piece for me, is really around giving people an environment in which they can succeed. That's what I do with my team. I recruit great people, give them an environment in which they can succeed, and let them do their job. And the external environment is very important to us as well. And I guess this feeds to the social and the governance piece. We donate 2% of our revenues, not our profits, our revenues every year, to things that we are passionate about. If you've seen anything on my social media recently, we announced gift grants, girls and football teams. I used to be a footballer. I've still got the injuries to show for it. So we've actually got a grant scheme which will support girls and football teams around the UK and internationally if we go that far, because it's something that we are passionate about. So it's part of our internal governance as well. We look at things that we've achieved through the year. What are our wins and how have our behaviours contributed to that? So it really underpins everything that we do. As Bananarama said, it ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. And we stand by that every day.
And I think from my perspective, I'll echo everything that Claire and Lindsay said, particularly what Lindsay was saying about some of the social kind of aspects. They are critical. It's how we operate, how we work, and how we're perceived. We've got to be an ethical business actually going ahead, and we've got to provide access to medicines, and that's to all patients, irrespective of geography, hopefully in the future. But I wouldn't understate actually the environmental side of our business as well, and the ability to make meaningful change. So if I just look at AstraZeneca itself, we're spending roughly about $12 billion per annum through our broader supply chain at the moment. So actually having climate commitments to be carbon negative by 2030 across the whole of our value chain means actually we're amplifying that change actually much more broadly than we have as a company on our own. So I wouldn't lose sight of that, plus also the interrelatedness of climate and the environment and people's health as well.
Yeah, and I'd love to add, just the point that Lindsay made, which is there is a sort of lack of awareness around what ESG, how it translates to life sciences, not only in the short term and then company specific, but also at a system level. And so while we may set company specific targets, and quite honestly, the ESG in life sciences has mostly been around risk mitigation in terms of healthcare reform and pricing and other issues, moving forward, thinking about healthcare system infrastructure strengthening and sustainability as we talk about, not just growth of our sector, because that's been the conversation around sustainability for life sciences, is getting access to science, IP, venture capital, but now really thinking about healthcare sustainability and how we want to have a life sciences industry for not only patients now, but also for our children and for science in the future. And that's something that has not even entered the conversation, at least to my knowledge, to date.
Fab. So perhaps, Jason, one for you, but how important is the ESG strategy as part of a corporate agenda? And how do you prioritize projects? And have you seen any impact in corporate activity, bearing in mind the events of the last year?
I think from our perspective, ESG is integral to our corporate agenda. So obviously AstraZeneca is an innovation-based biopharmaceutical company, and we've got to anticipate the standard of care at least 10 years out, and the fixed patent clock we've got on our innovative medicines. That means in order for us to be economically sustainable as a business, we've got to continually reinvent ourselves and actually remain patient, but also societal centric and even environmentally centric. Within AstraZeneca, our sustainability agenda is aligned with our business. It's primarily focused on access to medicines, but actually we've got two additional pillars around environmental protection, but also around ethics and transparency, and that brings in more of that social dimension that Lindsay talked about earlier on. And the priorities that we've got have been decided through our own materiality assessments conducted 3 years ago with a number of key internal and external stakeholders and an external sustainability advisory board as well. And we're actually about to update that materiality assessment again this year. But I think central to our sustainability agenda is that recognition that the health of people, the health of the economy and the planet are actually all interconnected. And we've got to do more than our fair share to address our impact on the planet, climate change, but we've got to do that while building resilience actually into our business, our supply chain, to ensure we're future proofed against future events, whether or not it's a pandemic or they're climatic related events. So what we aim to do is obviously continue to innovate, remain patient centric and provide that access to medicines. But our priorities around patient access to medicines isn't just around the provision of medicines to patients. And in low and middle income countries, we, excluding the COVID vaccine, we reached 25 million patients cumulatively kind of last year, but we also focus on disease prevention. So it's working with Plan, the Young Health Programme, to tackle poor lifestyle choices in adolescence. And actually disease prevention is right at the top of my environmental work in terms of the hierarchy about avoiding, reducing, substituting and eliminating. Well, disease prevention is avoidance of waste, avoidance of climate emissions, avoiding having to treat people. Then we also don't just look at providing medicines, it's about investing in healthcare systems and training healthcare professionals, again, in low and middle income countries. So over the last few years, we've trained more than 130,000 healthcare workers to diagnose disease. So it's not just the provision of medicines. And then it's thinking about the clinical trials we do and the outreach of the medicines that we've got. So it's embracing more diversity, more innovation, actually within that clinical trial design right from the outset. And if I think a little bit closer to home and the work that I do on environmental protection, for us, it's really about decoupling natural resource use actually from our business growth. So whether or not that's reductions that we're looking at in greenhouse gas emissions, water, embracing circularity to reduce our waste, or looking at the environmental footprint and the properties of our medicines. But since 2015, we've managed to reduce our Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions in absolute terms by 60%. We've reduced our water consumption by 20%, but actually we've increased our revenue by 30%. So you can actually grow sustainably from an environmental perspective, treat more patients actually with a lower footprint. And most of the natural resource reductions that we're generating come with a return on investment, and that increases the affordability, but also the accessibility of our medicines across the global economy. So you have to look at access, you have to look at environmental protection, because actually savings on environmental protection do help with affordability and access. And then for us, it's about following the science. It's one of our values, the same as doing the right thing. And that's not just with a patient centricity, it's following the science of climate change. So last year, in the face of COVID, we also launched Ambition Zero Carbon. So that's to be carbon zero for our own operations by 2025, but to be carbon negative across the whole value chain by 2030. So that's focused on green design, energy efficiency, emissions avoidance and reduction, transitioning to 100% renewable sources for heat and power, transitioning 17,000 vehicles over to electric vehicles for our field force, and looking at next generation propellants in our asthma devices that have a near zero global warming potential. And alongside that, planting 50 million trees. So there's a lot that we can do as a company, and looking at our value chain to embrace that change. But there's more that we can do looking at healthcare more systematically and holistically. And I know we're working with Sustainable Healthcare Coalition, and I know Healthcare Without Harm published something a couple of years ago that said if healthcare was a country, it would have the fourth or fifth largest carbon budget of any country. So what we're trying to do is actually look at opportunities to deliver improved patient care with a lower environmental footprint than the current standard of care. So looking not just at the clinical benefits of early diagnosis and clinical or non-clinical intervention, but actually looking at the environmental outcomes and environmental improvements, because anything that stops hospitalization, surgery, that comes at a huge cost to individuals, families, and society, actually will deliver huge benefits to the environment. And obviously the events of last year have just shown the importance of long-term sustainability planning and embedding resilience into everything we do. Short-term thinking is not an option. So even since COVID has come and kind of impacted us globally, actually we've signed on to the Sustainable Markets Initiative Circular Bioeconomy Alliance, the Terra Carta Initiative, and both of those actually recognise that interdependence between human and planetary health. So health's our goal, whether or not it's individual, community, economic, or the health of the planet.
Perhaps I'll just refer to a couple of questions that have come in. One, based on Jason's comments, does he believe we should have across the field ESG policy that standards should be met?
I think we need some kind of core policies. That I think there's a lot of reporting kind of standards that are coming out at the moment. That takes quite a lot of time and effort for teams to and businesses to fill that in. So I think consolidation is needed wherever possible. We made our first disclosure to TCFD last year, so the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. We see that as a good framework to actually build resilience in terms of the physical climate risks that we face as a business, but actually also some of those transitional risks that we face with the movement to a migration to a low carbon economy. So in my area, that works quite well. So I think if you've got the right metrics, the right indicators, I think consolidation around some common reporting standards are correct. And from an environmental perspective, I don't think intensity is the right measure. I know most of the targets I'm working to are all absolute based. So whether or not it's water reduction or greenhouse gas reduction, the planet doesn't see things linked to a dollar revenue. It actually sees the tons or the meters cubed of actually what we're emitting or discharging or taking from the environment.
Hey, Holly, there's some really amazing literature around sort of the phases as a company thinks about sustainability, and sort of the first phase is just compliance. And so that's where policy really comes in, is, you know, you have to do what is mandated by law. And that's usually the first sort of step for companies, is just to invest in compliance. And then the second is really around legitimate So anything beyond compliance, it's thinking through the lens of how do we legitimize this through our current business strategy and operations. And then the third sort of phase of thinking, which I think Jason's really beautifully illustrated, is when it truly is integral to the performance of the company, and they've been able to hone in on those strategic intersections, but also see ways that they can contribute to the broader good. And I think that's where policy has a role in terms of standards and regulations, but it's only a starting point, because it won't get them over the additional hurdles of having to negotiate internally and make it make sense to their shareholders. And then beyond that, really helping them think, how do you design ESG sustainability into the overall business plan?
I just want to come in and follow on from what Alice and Jason said, and they both made excellent points. But on the standardization piece, that is one area that is really focusing the minds of not just investors, but key stakeholders everywhere, regulators, legislators. Because even though there are plenty of very useful frameworks, I mentioned SASB as one of them earlier, but there's TCFD, GRI, and plenty of others. Plenty of people talk about the alphabet soup. They're useful, but these are all voluntary frameworks. So as far as going with compliance, there aren't actually that many laws to comply with in this field. It's just a case of companies choosing what suits their company and their stakeholders best. So quite a lot of the conversation at the moment, particularly among standard setters and investors, is how do we standardize what's out there already? The IFRS Foundation is doing quite a lot of work on selecting what's in what are known as value relevant, decision relevant to investors standards, and there's a lot of work being done on that, which will definitely advance over the remainder of this year. But everybody's thinking exactly, how do we create a common baseline for companies to report against, so that there can be more comparability, more consistency, and more reliability, so that people can make decisions on which companies they want to be invested in, which they want to do business with, and so on and so forth going into the future.
I suppose for small and medium-sized companies and private companies in particular, how easy is this to either adhere to or establish? What do small companies need to have in place at the very least? Perhaps one for you, Paul.
Well, so this is all very interesting in the sense that obviously from a top-down perspective, it's all very important and it's very worthy. And you've got people like Lindsay talking about how it should be measured, and people like Jason who are actually focused on delivering it. Then there's the reality of how this stuff gets used in the investment world and for objective benchmarking. So what happens is that there are a plethora of consultants out there who provide ratings for companies, and they all have slightly different ways of doing this, but they broadly follow a framework which you can download and you can understand. But the execution of this process is, in my eyes at least, pretty appalling. And you shouldn't underestimate how kind of Wild West this all is, and I certainly would applaud broad-based regulation for it. So the likelihood is, if you're a small company, you are going to get rated whether you engage with a rating agency or not. They are probably not even going to bother contacting you. They are going to base their assessment of you on what they can find in the public domain. The people that are doing it are probably going to be quite junior, and they're not going to spend very long on it. So if you are a small company, you have a big problem. If you're AstraZeneca or a very large entity, you have the people and the skills within your organization to proactively engage with these agencies and make sure they understand exactly what you're doing and they score you appropriately. And when we talk to companies that we invest in who we find have lagging ratings based on, MSCI or Sustainalytics or whatever it might be, generally the response that comes back is, don't worry about our rating, we've engaged some consultants and it will go up next year because, we understand how to basically disclose things differently on our website or in a better way, make data available in order that we can get rated appropriately. And then the other element of this is that these people make a huge amount of mistakes in what they do. So the company that I'm involved with, we're obviously a healthcare investment company. We had an organisation recommend against a vote for our board because they had decided we were an oil and gas exploration company. Now that just goes to show the kind of level of effort that's going into some of these assessments that are going on. So if you're a small company, I think the first and most important thing is you have to understand that people are going to benchmark you against your peers. And if you are a small company with 10, 20, 30 people, they're still going to compare you against the aggregated score for your industry, which is going to include AstraZeneca. And they are going to be better on diversity and inclusion than you are. They're going to be better on graduate training and recruitment. They're going to have better employee benefits. So you have to be realistic. You are not going to get a score that is comparable to a large international company. So you need to be able to explain to investors, prospective investors or existing investors or whoever you're partnering with, why your scores are not in line with the median for the industry group that you're in. And you need to make sure that all of the information that you do have is prepared in line with the way you're going to be assessed and is easily available via websites or publicly disclosed documents. So you have the best opportunity possible to get a fair rating for the activities that you're doing. And as someone said earlier, you know, the social and governance pillars are far more important for the life sciences industry than the environmental one, because of the way the scores are weighted, and that varies from industry to industry. So I think this is something you have to engage with at a senior level. You have to think about strategically, and you have to make sure that you make it as easy as possible for the people that are going to judge you to do that work, because they are going to spend, at the moment at least, very, very little time on ensuring that they do it well.
There's a question there, Paul, asking, does that not come down to the level of due diligence that you can do so internally?
Well, I mean, when we, from my perspective as an investor, you know, these ratings, these assessments are a facet of how we consider companies. And clearly we understand the limitations of some of these things. I mean, again, you know, you can't expect, or you shouldn't expect a small company to have as broad a board in number as a large company in terms of members, and therefore you're not going to expect the same level of diversity on that board as you would expect on, you know, a FTSE 100 PLC or an S&P 500 company or whatever it might be. So with all of these things, one has to use it as part of a pragmatic, human-in-the-loop framework where you actually look at things and you say, you know, where is this company in its journey of development? Where does it plan to go and what are its intentions? You know, you may not meet the current gold standard for something, but it may well be that you will in due time. So for example, you know, supply chain analysis is a significant part of these ratings, but if you're a pre-commercial company, you might not be doing these supply chain analysis because you don't have a supply chain. So the important thing there is to actually make sure you disclose what your principles are generally, even though you're not actually following them at this current moment in time, rather than say, oh, we don't have a supply chain policy because we don't need a supply chain. So it's things like that. But I mean, you just have to be pragmatic and realistic. The challenge for me is that because we tend to invest more in small and mid-cap companies, they will in aggregate score lower than a large cap weighted portfolio. So we have to spend time explaining to investors why the system doesn't work and why you can't do numerical sort of quantitative scoring based analysis to compare one portfolio of investments with another. That will lead you down the wrong track. And it's also, again, you've only got to give people a few examples of some large companies in, you know, extractive or highly pollutive industries that have incredibly good ESG scores. And they continue to rise every year. You know, Coca-Cola produces ever more disposable plastic bottles, and its ESG rating climbs ever higher year on year. So you need to just think pragmatically about what these things actually mean.
There's another question that's coming for you. I'll try and address all the questions as best I can. But Paul, how do you weigh an ESG score with potential financial return?
It's a bit sort of Google-esque, but we obviously follow the UN principles. So Bellevue has a detailed, the company I work for has a detailed ESG policy. It's a key part of our framework. So we don't invest in companies that are doing bad things, but we look to contextualize the scores and the ratings that they get. So for example, as I alluded to earlier, you know, we will excuse below median governance for a small company that's an early stage pre-commercial entity. Now, again, if we were considering AstraZeneca, we would expect it to be at the very highest level of compliance with all those things because of its stage of development and size as a company. So that's the reality of how it works for us. It is part of framework, but the context is everything. And I think, again, when you start looking into some of these things, some of them can get pretty bent out of shape pretty quickly. So, could your technology be used for manipulation of human embryonic stem cells is one of the things that some of these agencies look at. Well, I mean, you go into the life science tools sector, well, that's pretty much everybody at the margin could be used to do that sort of thing. And you might end up getting penalized for that. So it's understanding the framework, it's understanding what the issues are, what the companies have been flagged for, and what that means pragmatically. The reality is the vast majority of companies in this sector are doing good for society and for the planet. They are relieving human suffering, and that of and in itself is a worthy activity. They're not selling weapons or making cigarettes or any of those sorts of things. So it's worth keeping that in mind as well, that this is just a small part of what a company is actually doing. You can't reduce an entity to a single score.
Thanks, Paul. There's a couple of questions that are coming in around collaboration, but Alice, perhaps I'll start with you and then I can address some of the questions that have come through. But how important is ESG in choosing organisations to partner and collaborate with, and how important is impact investing?
Sure. No, happy to answer that. I think that, every company is going to have a slightly different ESG lens in terms of what is the marketplace for impact and what are they looking for in terms of a partner. So it can either be, just like on the investment side, a negative screen, or it can actually be one where they're really looking for a partner to help achieve their environmental, social, governance targets. And that's where, groups like American Cancer Society, other nonprofits maybe in the past would have been seen through the lens of, corporate social responsibility, philanthropic donations, and that's an investment towards impact. And so that model continues, and the investment component there now takes a slightly different lens in the form of holding those organizations accountable and actually wanting to see performance. And so what I can say is, in my own sort of career journey after the first 25 years in biopharma industry, mostly in public policy, market access, and R&D roles, I know a little bit about making medicines. I know a lot about making money from selling medicines, and I know too much about helping patients find money to access and afford medicines. And so for me, ESG was really my compass in choosing to shift career paths and join the social sector. And I think that's where organizations like American Cancer Society, where impact is at the core, we are not only a service provider, if you will, of really the output of the impact that companies might be looking to achieve that go beyond what they are accountable for delivering through their processes and to their shareholders, but also, really as an intermediary, as a strategic partner in helping create alternative solutions and platforms to achieve, something broader than what a single donation or transaction might do. At BrightEdge, where we are the impact investment arm of the American Cancer Society, so we are adopting now a market-based model in also helping the society achieve financial resilience. And so if you can imagine, the COVID pandemic really will result in multiple aftershocks for the cancer ecosystem moving forward, because cancer screenings were halted, scientific research was stalled. And so what you're finding is we're going to have a tsunami of additional need, and yet an organization that had traditionally fundraised through events and in-person engagements was really set back. And so the model of a not-for-profit engaging in for-profit investing in an area where there is specialist domain knowledge, meaning both the science of cancer, but also really clear understanding of what those system level gaps are, what the persistent unmet needs are across the ecosystem, what the downstream barriers are for patients at the system level, at the payer provider level, bringing those earlier to product development, helping to really inject patient-centric thinking in an environment which may be more finance first in terms of the VCs that are sitting around the table, could have really, broader effects in terms of addressing the market incentives, where we're seeing in some ways healthcare disparities is the global climate change for healthcare, and that our current marketplace continues to prefer, the more profitable what may be at times well-addressed diseases, whereas the public health companies or companies that have truly high-risk novel approaches, or maybe ones that are serving marginalized populations, are currently not being picked up by the traditional venture capital and investor community. And so we really see a gap forming between the innovation agenda and the health equity crisis that we face. And BrightEdge is in a unique position where we take our donor dollars, an allocation of the donor dollars, and invest those for return. And so we identify opportunities based on the need that we see through the lens of conquering cancer, reducing mortality by 40% by 2035. We make decisions, though, based on return, because until cancer is cured, there will be patients who will be calling the American Cancer Society for navigation, for free rides, for lodging, to be able to reach specialist treatment centers. So I think impact investing is important because we all have accountability. Companies are setting their goals. There's an impact marketplace, and they want to see those dollars work hard and see performance for that investment and impact. But I think moving forward, impact investing and being able to really demonstrate through market-based models how we can achieve impact and correct some of these, quite honestly, failures to achieve sustainability in the long run is the opportunity that we see at BrightEdge and American Cancer Society.
Does anybody have one thing to add?
Can I just come in on that? So we've talked quite a bit around the investor push and the ratings and the scorings in terms of ESG. What we've seen over the last year to 18 months is that the focus is really on us from a patient perspective. What we've demonstrated is that we can produce vaccines in just under a year, which is phenomenal. Now, the life cycle and the timeline to get a molecule, now not a vaccine, but a molecule from discovery all the way through to market is around 15 years, long time. Now, I don't think patients are going to take that anymore. We were, up until recently, the second most hated industry in the world. Let's not let this crisis go to waste. You know, people are thinking that, you know, scientists are doing a good thing. The pharma industry, the life science ecosystem has a really positive impact on people's lives. We are now under scrutiny from an investment perspective, from an environmental perspective, and from a patient perspective. So we've got to think about how we're going to do things differently in the future and what that means to our processes, our people, and our impact.
Anybody else got anything to add before I refer to one of our questions? So Jason, what can AZ do to support its partners, collaboration partners, biotech counterparts and the like, to achieve positive ESG outcomes when those partners perhaps don't possess the resources of the big pharma? Do they already have such programs in place?
I think for us, it's kind of that shared vision, that shared purpose that we've got to generate, whether or not it's that social dimension, the patient-centric dimension, or even the environmental dimension. So I know there's a question in that's asked about, well, are our kind of expectations of the third-party companies included in our carbon targets? Well, yes, they are. So we expect many of our suppliers actually to embrace that journey to net zero and sign on to science-based targets. But actually, that's not an expectation that we're going to put on them and leave them to get to grips with actually on their own. So we're talking to like-minded leading pharma companies that have got quite aggressive climate targets themselves, and we're working across our pharmaceutical groups to think about, well, how can we help the SMEs, the broader healthcare community of partners, actually embrace net zero and some of those broader challenges. So for one example could be in the space of kind of renewable power. So obviously we're setting up our own power purchase agreements for renewable energy within AstraZeneca, but why can't we do that as a pharma sector, actually collaborating with a power or a utility company and actually do a supplier-based power purchase agreement? And they're issues that we are doing actually at the moment through the Pharmaceutical Environment Group. And there's a whole raft of other ESG related issues that we can look from an ecosystem approach. And I know for ourselves, where we are working with external suppliers, we do have a supplier sustainability framework, which has a whole series of maturity ladders, which again is trying to give them some guidance on what kind of decisions, what kind of choices they may want to make. But we're not just looking at a supplier by supplier or partner by partner basis from an environmental perspective. We're also looking at the goods and services that we may be taking from some of those partners. And we're asking the question, maybe from an environmental life cycle management perspective, how can we reduce the greenhouse gas footprint of that goods or service? Or how can we reduce the water footprint actually of it? Because at the end of the day, we can look at our company ambitions, we can look at our environmental or sustainability footprints of our sites, but actually some of the transitional risks that we're facing in the marketplace with climate change are going to be on our products. So we're going to have healthcare providers ask us, what is the environmental footprint of our product? Can we integrate that actually in with the clinical benefits that it brings? So for us, it's having that focus on the environmental footprint of our products, what we can do to take those down to net zero, or potentially even in the future, water positive, that's driving us, and looking at that where each supplier is actually touching that product in addition to ourselves, and invoking change through a couple of different lenses. But partnerships is going to be critical to the delivery of our sustainability targets, be them environmental or be them delivering social change within our company, or actually working out in communities, delivering access to healthcare and training healthcare professionals, because we're not at the coalface actually out in lower middle income countries. We're working with third-party groups, NGOs and others, and healthcare providers to actually train up individuals in diagnosis as well as the provision of medicines in a sustainable manner. So partnerships are going to be critical for all the challenges we face.
Holly, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. How important is it for small companies to collect that footprint data so that they can plan to be sustainable in the future? And what would be the ideal way to do that?
I think for me, I think even small companies, they're going to have to start collecting, if we think again from just the greenhouse gas emissions and a climate perspective, their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So their direct and indirect power energy use, whether or not they've got F-gases, whether or not they've got vehicles, and then obviously their imported power. Actually, for many of them, if they've just got imported electricity, then that transition to renewables is quite easy. Clean, affordable industrial heat actually is quite a significant challenge. And it's a challenge I'm having to address at the moment in our transition to net zero or carbon zero. I think we'll be putting more and more emphasis on their scope 3 emissions, so their broader value chain emissions over time. At the moment, we make some assumptions as what that would be. But I think if they're, so yes, they've got to report their own company footprints, but I think if they have got particular goods and services that they're looking to provide to big pharma, I think understanding the broader footprint of those goods or services they're providing, be it a device, be it a diagnostic, be it services to provide clinical trials, then I think they're the lens that maybe some of the big companies are going to be looking at increasingly over time. And things like COVID have delivered kind of benefits in terms of how we sell through kind of digital e-detailing, but also in terms of how we're designing our clinical studies. So there's less patient travel that's actually going in, how we're shipping our medicines actually out as part of those trials. And actually they all come with quite an environmental upside, but actually they also promote some inclusion and more diversity actually within many of those trials for communities that may have not have been able to afford or had the willingness to travel to some of the care centres. So yeah, there's different ways in which we're going to start looking at things, but the focus unfortunately, it's going to be on more and more data, more and more disclosure, particularly as some of the bigger companies are going to have to credibly demonstrate that they've actually met their net zero commitments actually in a manner that's going to stand the test of time. So it's not just going straight off to compensation and offsetting. We've got to show the work we've done on avoidance, reduction and substitution first, and follow a hierarchy of delivery.
And then moving on to more of the S and the G, how important is it, ESG in general, to attracting the best talent? And do we think it's right now that some management are, ESG is increasingly featured in their remuneration schemes? Maybe one for you, Claire?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're a small company, as I said, and we provide services, strategy, stories. There are lots of other organizations that do some of this or all of this. So we have a number of competitors, and what sets us apart is how we do things. For me, my people are the only asset that I have, and therefore I have to demonstrate the impact that we have and what we do as an organization. So in terms of how we attract people, 10% of everybody's time is that they're able to do something they're passionate about, something they believe in, whether it's supporting a charity or teaching kids how to play the violin or the banjo. I really don't mind. I think it's so important to treat people in that way, so that they are not just contributing to their work, they're contributing to society as well. Do I think it's important in remuneration? Yes, I do, because it's not just about what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. It's how you are giving back and how you're supporting that wider ecosystem, how you're supporting your team. And I regularly, so in our monthly management meetings, we go through what have we achieved this month, but as individuals, what have our teams done, how have they worked together, what have they done outside of work with their 10% of their time, so that it's visible and they are rewarded for that. We've little internal awards. We have booze, shoes and snooze awards. I'm a shoe fan, as you can see by my dress, but simple things like that make the difference to attracting talent to my organization rather than our competitors. So yeah, I think it underpins everything that we do.
Any other thoughts on that? Otherwise, I'll just go back to some of the questions that have come through.
Yeah,
I'm happy to. Sorry, Jason, you first.
Yeah, I completely concur with Claire. I think what we're doing in the sustainability space and the broader ESG agenda is critical to talent acquisition at the moment. So most millennials and even younger are obviously looking at the credentials of the company, the ambition, the journey they're on. They're looking at the values of that company and their broader credibility, but they're looking also at how they're embracing lifelong learning, how they're going to be trained, how they're going to be skilled up actually within that organization, but also how they're embracing inclusion and diversity completely across the patch. And I know, again, within AstraZeneca, we have a Global Inclusion and Diversity Council. It's chaired by the CEO. So its own right actually from the top, but we have a huge number of employee resource groups there, be it from the LGBTQIA plus community right the way through from mental health, neurodiversity, but also kind of disability related groups, and they're tackling all the policies, the procedures that we've got in place actually with that inclusion and diversity mindset. And I know from a remuneration perspective, we had our delivery against our Ambition Zero carbon commitments included in the executive remuneration earlier this year. So that went through our AGM in May.
Can I pick up on a piece and quite controversially disagree with one of the other panelists that mentioned earlier that actually it's more difficult for small companies to have an impact with ESG than it is for the larger companies? I think from a diversity perspective, we absolutely can. I'm a big believer in building diversity by design. So always being conscious of your hires and whether you are diverse in the people you have within your team, whether that's gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, ability, always thinking about that, and we have the ability to build that within our teams rather than to retrofit it within a larger organization. And I think we should actually be holding up the small and medium-sized companies who do this very well as a standard, and we should be discussing what they are doing and how they have built that and underpinned that into their organizations, not just thinking about, okay, what are the large committees that the larger organizations have, and perhaps reflecting that in the due diligence process and how sustainable an organization is because of the diversity that it has built in.
Yeah, completely echo what Jason and Claire have mentioned there. I do speak a lot to investors and companies about the importance of the purpose narrative for the organization. So in terms of outlining why investors should invest in your company or why people should work for you, everyone's very, very focused on what kind of difference they're going to make in the world if they work for a company. Are they going to do things that are positive? Do people like them succeed there and do great things? Or from the investor perspective, is this a company that is going to be around for the long term, that society is prepared to support and tolerate its products and its practices? But coming back to a secondary point you made on management remuneration schemes, I feel like where investors are at the moment with that is, yes, it's appropriate, because I think Jason mentioned the word integral. ESG is not an add-on to strategy, it is a description of strategy. And whether companies are thinking consciously about ESG factors or not, investors, employees, stakeholders, regulators are considering them against those metrics. But in terms of including them in management remuneration schemes, where investors tend to be is, yes, let's have a focus on what is material to this business, whether that's on the financial side or the environmental or social side. But also, let's not lose sight of the fact that companies do have to perform for certain financial and strategic outcomes, that all should be in the mix, and that senior management should actually be rewarded for delivering against those as well as the ESG, and not divert the focus completely away from that. So there is a bit of a balance to be struck for many companies there.
Would you tend to agree, Paul, as an investor?
I think everybody, ultimately investment products are discretionary elective purchases by people. People find funds that meet their requirements, and they're interested in how they're managed, and they're interested in these sorts of things, I think, from a relative point of view. So people don't want to be involved in doing bad stuff, right? So nobody wants to be invested in an entity that is rated poorly and not obviously contributing to society. I think this is personally a bit of a tangential debate for the life sciences industry, because fundamentally your healthcare is the one product, whether you want to or not, you're going to consume in your life, and it's going to make a significant difference to your life quality. Because let's be honest, if we didn't have a healthcare system, probably most of us on this call wouldn't still be here right now. That's the reality of life. So I think healthcare gets a bit of a free pass on this stuff, but you shouldn't underestimate, ultimately, people that rate funds and decide to allocate to funds, they care about performance. So first and foremost, the company has to work as a financial investment. Secondly, it has to not be a force for bad in the world. And, that can take many different forms. Drug pricing clearly is more and more of an issue as time goes on. I think the industry hasn't helped itself because it's done a very poor job of communicating the low levels of R&D productivity that it has, and also doing anything about solving that. That's a secondary issue of in itself, right? But the challenges of running a pharmaceutical business as a profitable enterprise are quite challenging, and that feeds back into drug pricing. So there's a lot that I think the industry could do to explain to wider society better that it isn't actually evil. But someone made this point earlier, if you look at the health insurance industry and you look at the drug industry, they have amongst the lowest consumer ratings in the US, despite the fact that, they're doing the opposite of killing people every day, right? So I think all of this is a little bit secondary. First and foremost, people are still interested in financial metrics. They're still interested in companies that can continue to deliver growth and deliver investment returns. They're increasingly interested that those enterprises are not at the margin doing bad things. And I think that's where ESG is increasingly being used. But as I alluded to earlier, I think it's being used in a blunt instrument way. We're in the very early innings of all of this, and I think people don't quite know what they want or what they're looking for. They all kind of feel they've got to be doing something, and they're trying to work out what that something is.
And I'd love to add to Paul's comment in that, there is a brighter future moving forward. And I totally agree with you also as an investor, but investing alongside, traditional finance first investors. I think I'm a big believer in do what you can where you are with what you have. And part of it is really creating models and functionality that are familiar to people. And so, the ability for American Cancer Society and BrightEdge to enter into really competitive oncology deals requires lead investors to appreciate the bigger picture, that by, a not-for-profit participating in what could be, a high upside from a financial return standpoint, it will actually go back and fuel the needed social safety net services that we all depend on and rely on for our products to ultimately reach patients. Now, if you were to ask a small company whether or not they would write that, sort of philanthropic check, or if you ask the venture capitalists, the answer might not be yes. And so we have to be innovative even on the not-for-profit and impact social sector side to find ways for others to basically, participate in ESG where they are with what they have, however they can. And I think that the impact investing space, at least this model, promises to at least penetrate the private companies, the small emerging companies, as well as the traditional financial first healthcare investors.
Thank you, Alice. I'll refer to a question. So does a focus by large caps and their investors on recording and driving down measurable environmental impact, for example, make it harder to win contracts compared to, for example, the equally large CROs that have similar capacity to measure and report such things? Anyone want to attempt to answer that one?
So I can't really speak to contracts and I don't know what CROs are, but having said that, it has been observed in the investor space that there is very much a large company bias towards ESG, simply because they're the organizations that appear to be best equipped to give the level of disclosure that particularly ratings agencies or investors making analysis are looking for. So there is a bit of an obstacle to overcome for smaller companies in that space, and I'm sure that's probably true when it comes to pitching for business as well. And I think that kind of comes back to the importance of being able to disclose your narrative to your stakeholders, whether that's customers or investors or employees, just to ensure that they know the impact that you're trying to make, what your strategy is, something that they can get behind to back your business for the years to come.
Yeah, CROs are an interesting example for somebody to pick, because CROs do contract research, so they do a lot of the early stage research for the pharmaceutical industry. They achieve all sorts of interesting economies of scale and very good at patient recruitment. So the CRO model is growing. But cynically, you could also say, CROs are very useful for companies, because you can get rid of all those small furry animals from your labs and the CRO can do it all for you. And then you can say, well, we don't do animal testing, but actually legally everyone's doing animal testing because it's a requirement. You're just outsourcing it to a third party. So again, that comes back to the point that Jason made earlier about scope. It's not just about directly what you're doing, it's about indirectly in your whole supply chain and the impact of that people really should be thinking about. Not whether or not you're actually doing something, it's whether or not your business activities result in something happening. And outsourced manufacturing, outsourced research, they are classic examples of how you can get something that some people might not like off your balance sheet, but it doesn't mean it's not going on anymore.
Thanks, Paul. So what are the key problems facing companies and government, or lack of regulation? Should it be regulated? And do we think that government should move towards some ESG incentives to help startups and university spin-outs? Anyone want to take that one?
I'm happy to start. I mean, I personally think there needs to be some standard set for the quality of these third-party ESG assessments that are being done. I mean, we need to remember that the financial crisis of 2008 chiefly came because there was no regulation of rating agencies, and people came up with ways of gaming the rating agency systems to create hybrid financial instruments that then blew everybody up by undisclosed amounts of leverage. And this isn't directly comparable, but we are in a situation where there's a race going on amongst these rating agencies to sell their products to people who want to do ESG assessment of investments, and they want to cover as much ground as possible. So there's this sort of arms race to cover as many companies as possible. And what is suffering in this race to cover everybody, from starting with the top of the market cap scale down to the bottom, is the quality of the work that they're doing. And I find that very concerning, as I said earlier, because I think it ends up penalizing small companies. And that's very unfortunate, because again, if you are AstraZeneca, you don't actually need external capital to keep your business going. It's a cash generative business in its own right. If you are an earlier stage company, you are dependent on external ratings, on raising capital, on getting people to buy into what you're doing. And obviously, if you're not rated in a fair and appropriate manner, it's going to have a much more deleterious impact on your business than if you're a large company and you can kind of weather it out. So I think this is something that really should be regulated, or at least there should be some minimum standards. And I don't think you should be able to claim that you're rating a company and scoring a company if you've never actually met the management, for example, or engaged with the company in a meaningful way. Now, these companies, they will admit that they haven't met the management. It's all in the small print of the particular report, but you shouldn't be allowed to do that, in my opinion.
Thanks, Paul. Anything to add, Lindsay? Or?
Sure, I think Paul made some very good points on the outcomes that these rating agencies often get. I think one complaint that I've often heard from investors, in addition to that, is that there isn't quite the transparency in the methodology that they would like to see from those rating agencies. It tends to be a case of data goes in one end, rating comes out the other, and nobody knows what happens in between. So perhaps that's another area that might need to be addressed in terms of allowing users and people who feed into this process to see exactly what process they're being subjected to, which would definitely help the market.
Yeah, and I think all I can do is just reiterate what Lindsay and Paul have said, that I think that there's probably some policy, some regulation is needed, some consolidation is needed, particularly around some key material issues. But I think transparency is absolutely critical in terms of what the outcomes are from some of these agencies and ratings and how they've scored them. Again, a little bit closer maybe to my patch, the one area for which I know we have a lot of credibility in, or put a lot of credibility in at the moment, is around CDP and some of the disclosures that we have to make on water, climate and forest, and they come in as a request actually from our investors. But there is a lot of engagement that will actually go on with that community, and actually our auditors are actually all over that, because there are some financial material statements that we have to make in terms of how we're mitigating and managing some risks within those disclosures. And I think obviously TCFD, again, for mitigating physical and transitional climate risks for businesses going ahead, is going to be increasingly kind of important. And obviously it was mandated at the I think November last year by the Financial Standards Authority, that UK premium listed companies and particularly some of the investment pension companies have got to disclose to that on a disclose or explain basis in future years. So at least you can see how companies are going to be building resilience in facing the threat of climate change if we don't control it, but also managing those transitional risks if we do migrate to a low carbon economy.
Yeah. Another question from one of the audience members: what will be the priorities in advancing the ESG agenda for the industry for the next decade, and has that changed after the pandemic? Who should we go to first?
Well, I can comment from the standpoint of, so many of our corporate partners who were not as vocal, at least in the US, about social injustice, racial injustice, healthcare disparities, now all of a sudden seem to be really actively looking for partners to help generate solutions and also operationalize programs and initiatives, and really have broader discussions. And those can be at the policy level, they can be at the community level. I think there's just a heightened level of awareness that we've never seen before, and that will translate into, just more ESG target setting at the company level, more multi-sector platforms to be able to act collectively around some of these bigger goals, as well as, a greater opening for collaboration across different entities to work collaboratively, so it's not as transactional as it was in the past. So I definitely think in the US at least, which many of the companies and groups represented here have links in some way, we will be seeing quite a bit of catch up in terms of the ESG mindset and culture. And that's where, I do believe that we can all have a more robust and comprehensive conversation around sustainability. The other thing that I was just going to mention in the previous conversation around government mandates or compliance, I mean, so many companies these days, including companies that are represented on this call, make public their own policy. So there's self-governance internally, and as people try to get their heads around not only what the company says, but what does it do and how does it implement its principles into internal policies. Do they make those policies public? Do they then advocate for policy changes more broadly? Is just again a great way for vendors, suppliers, future partners to get an understanding of where those larger companies' minds are at, but also to anticipate market opportunities in terms of growth for services and products.
Holly, can I come in on that? I would like to see a focus on people and purpose over products and profits. And really, as Alice was saying, companies are kind of self-policing. They're writing about what they're going to do. I'd like to see more of a focus on deeds, not words. So actually, you said you're going to do this. What are you doing with regard to your people? How are you supporting your people? And what we've seen is that the pandemic has really had an impact on women in the workforce. So women in caring responsibilities, childcare. I'm surprised my 4.5-year-old hasn't made an appearance at some point today. So I would like to see more focus on how we can support women, not so that they can survive in the roles, but they can thrive.
I think Alice and Claire make some excellent points there. And I think the way the reporting and investing agenda has moved, it's important to remember that with so much talk of fairness in the world now, it's important to remember that disclosure is not the same as progress. And so investors are increasingly starting to push for progress in certain areas rather than just disclosing what the status quo is. And I think that'll be important for many organizations to remember going forward.
Yeah, and that I think extends beyond institutional investors. So we're seeing heightened levels of shareholder activism, and so many, experiences that our colleagues in oil and gas and food and bev and environment have faced, I think, are starting to come for healthcare, whether it's access, affordability, it's diversity in clinical trials representation. The level of shareholder activism is also on the up and up within the life sciences and healthcare industry.
I think I'd echo what Lindsay said. We're in a period of epic amounts of greenwashing and people publishing statements about diversity, inclusion, all this sort of stuff. And I'm not trying to be cynical, but we know in many, many cases nothing changes apart from a statement gets added to an annual report or a website. So this is an inevitable reaction to the fact that people are more focused on this stuff. So hopefully over the next few years, what we can look forward to is getting all of that out of the way, and then we can actually start, as Claire sort of said, looking at this kind of saying, right, okay, you've said all that. What have you actually done over a meaningful period of time? Because it does take years to change cultures and reorganize supply chains. So we need to be pragmatic. We can't expect all these companies to, go net zero tomorrow or completely change how they do their business. We've got to give them a reasonable period of time. But I look forward to a period where we're actually, if we are going to talk about this issue, we're actually having a constructive, fact-based conversation about this issue rather than reading, ridiculous statements that have been made by companies or mandated by governments. I mean, you know, even again, as an example for us, we had to, for our investment trust, we had to ensure that we made statements on, you know, how our employees interact with the community and what we're doing on modern slavery. It's an investment company. It has no employees by definition, but the government has mandated, you know, everybody's got to produce this statement. And so we have several pages in an annual report that refer to something that's completely irrelevant because there are no employees within the entity that is the report. So, you know, this is an example of well-intended stuff that ends up not actually doing anything. So I really look forward to getting past that point and then going back to actually having discussions with people about how things are changing in the real world.
And I think just picking up on what Paul was saying, probably 2019, we were seeing lots and lots of pledges, particularly in the environmental areas, so pledges to be net zero by years X, Y, and Z, alignment with the science-based targets and the Paris Agreement. But I think there's a shift in mindset. That shift in mindset now is, how are you operationalizing it? How are you going to deliver it? How are you walking the talk? And we're seeing much more focus, particularly in some of the ESG events that I've got with some of our investors or prospective investors, actually wanting to know the delivery route, the delivery plan. I think also, as we're coming out of obviously the pandemic situation, I think expectations are very, very different on healthcare, as I think somebody raised earlier on, and that'd be the speed of delivery actually of medicines to patients. It's the accessibility of medicines more globally is going to be much more challenged, and we can see through the pandemic that actually, unless we get global access right and at the right scale, we're just going to see variants potentially come through, and we're just hoping that none of those actually get through the vaccines that we've got in place obviously at the moment. So I think there is going to be some expectation management. I think we do have to keep that patient focus, but not lose sight of our workforce, their well-being, the flexibility that they're going to probably want to actually work in different ways to how they've worked actually before. But I think it's also scaling up the speed at which we operate, and the reliance on partnerships across the whole of the healthcare ecosystem is something that we've got to build on and take forward, probably from that pandemic as well.
I don't know if anybody has any other additional questions. If you do, then feel free to either go off mute and ask the panel directly, or to message in the chat. But perhaps another one from me. Paul, you briefly touched on it, but where does animal welfare fit into ESG in life science companies?
Well, there are very clearly sort of animal husbandry standards that are followed and ethical practices around animal testing. And there are ongoing attempts to reduce, certainly in the preclinical phase, the amount of animal testing that gets done through computer modeling and cell-based systems and all these sorts of things. But again, we need to acknowledge that the regulatory environment is such that you have to do preclinical animal toxicology testing. That is the rules. And until we get to a point where the alternatives are sufficiently robust that the regulatory framework changes, we need to acknowledge that these companies have to do what they're doing, and they don't deserve to be penalized for it. You know, we've seen with the pandemic, people don't like seeing other people die needlessly of something that's potentially preventable. Well, if we didn't have preclinical toxicology testing, we'd have a lot more people dying unnecessarily. So we need to be pragmatic and see the whole picture. So I think I would imagine that animal welfare within the pharmaceutical industry is exemplary everywhere. And you know, that's one of the reasons why the CRO model is popular as well, because you can outsource these things to somebody who is a specialist managing these things, and it's easy for them to deploy all this stuff across their whole network of vivariums that they're managing for different companies and all this sort of thing. So quite honestly, it's not something I think about at all, but that's probably because I'm an insider looking out rather than an outsider looking in. I understand pragmatically why this is going on and how it's actually done. You know, nobody is torturing small bunnies for fun. That is not what the industry is doing.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any pertinent points they'd like to mention while we wrap up today?
Holly, I just wondered, there was a question early on. Did we cover this?
Sorry if I've missed any.
No. So during due diligence, how would the panel recommend to detect greenwashed companies versus genuine ESG exemplars? Sorry.
I think the one thing that we've been emphasizing is the importance of deciding what is truly material to your specific business or your specific business area, and telling a coherent and detailed story to your stakeholders in those areas. For the longest while, companies have taken very much a sort of corporate responsibility approach to what we now call ESG disclosures, and just disclose things that basically looked good. So how much paper are we recycling? What are we doing with our waste? How much have we reduced our greenhouse gas emissions, even if GHG emissions are not necessarily the biggest factor that affects our business? We're starting to see companies moving away from that, but it's the ones that are kind of emphasizing those areas that are not really material to their business, to their stakeholders, that are getting caught out with accusations of greenwashing, particularly when things go wrong. We've seen a lot of companies in various sectors, whether it's life sciences or mining or garment manufacturer, getting caught out particularly on, say, the human rights and employee welfare areas, that all of a sudden start to look like they've been greenwashing when they've been held up as examples of good ESG disclosures, but haven't necessarily been paying attention to areas that have a high impact on their business if they go wrong. So that's my thoughts on that. I wonder if the other panelists have anything to add.
I think the way I would look at it is, you know, if your composite score has changed materially over a short period of time, it warrants understanding of why that is. Now, within the governance pillar, you know, you may have been penalised because you have a small board. Now you've got a bigger board, so you've improved. That's fine. On the social side, you know, again, it might be that you've changed the way you report your diversity and inclusion kind of criteria, or you've put in place, you know, graduate recruitment and training, but you don't have any graduates. These kind of things, you can delve under the hood and maybe get a bit more colour. It's not really greenwashing because that's obviously the S&G pillar. On the E pillar, I think if that changes quickly, then the question is, you know, are you effectively outsourcing something that is still going on within your scope of your activities, but you've managed to effectively take it off balance sheet? That's probably the thing that we have to look forward to. But again, at this early stage in the ESG rating process, as I can't emphasize this enough, because I think it's vitally important that people recognize this is the reality. Lots and lots of companies have been rated unwittingly, almost without their participation. And now that they know what this is happening to them, they are adjusting and they're providing information that was always the way it is, but they just didn't know they had to disclose it or give it to a particular person so they could take it into account. So again, you need to just understand if a company's scores change very, very quickly, is it simply a case that they were passively rated before and they're now being proactively rated, or they're engaging with the process in a different way such that they can actually put their best foot forward? Because some of the ways that these companies are assessed are shocking. I'll give you an example. I read a report the other day, a company that we were invested in, its composite score went down, its rating got changed by 1 notch. We looked into what happened, and somebody had reviewed the company. They said they'd had an AGM. They said there'd been a vote against one of the directors. Therefore, that director must be a bad person. Therefore, the governance is bad. Therefore, we're reducing the score. They'd not done any analysis to understand who voted against the director, why did they vote against that director, what was the issue, is the issue going to be resolved? It was just an arbitrary, well, I can't tick this box anymore, so I'm going to take the score down. You have to be really careful of things like that in both directions, both up and down. And you know, as I say, hopefully as this whole industry matures, we'll get to a point where these ratings are done in a proper manner, in a thoughtful way, and then we won't have to worry about these things quite so much.
And I think from my perspective, when we're looking at greenwash, it's looking at what somebody's saying, but it's also how they've reached that outcome. It's really the how question for us, and it's also thinking quite holistically. Quite often greenwash can sometimes be the consequence of just looking in one dimension and not necessarily the longer term unintended consequences. So particularly if I'm looking at low carbon alternatives, maybe for a plastic or packaging within a device, actually I'll be looking much broader than the carbon footprint. I'll want to know what the water footprint is, its impact on eutrophication, its environmental toxicity that's actually coming through. If a site or a company is declaring to be net zero or carbon zero, I actually want to know how they've achieved it. Have they just jumped straight to compensation and planting trees in the same year that they're not sequestering carbon to hit that footprint? Or have they gone through active emissions reduction and avoidance and substitution to do that? So are they taking the easy route, or are actually they taking the more scientifically credible route from my regard? And quite often actually looking with a life cycle assessment lens, particularly around maybe alternatives that can come in as chemicals or intermediates or devices or plastics or packaging, will kind of protect us from maybe making the wrong decision. So for us, it's asking a lot of questions and scrutiny on the how, and thinking a little bit more holistically than maybe what somebody's branding something as. And I think sometimes you can look at maybe the plastic bag versus the jute bag, and how many times you've got to use a jute bag to offset maybe the carbon footprint of that plastic bag. So for me, there are trade-offs that you've got to look at sometimes, and yeah, you've got to read the small print, don't just read the headline.
You know, and another way to validate the how is to look at the strategic collaborations and whether they've worked with trusted partners who are reporting on impact in a neutral, unbiased way, where there isn't necessarily a commercial sort of agenda, if you will. And that's where, especially in the S side of ESG, the role of disease foundations and patient charities and not-for-profit research organizations who are focused on accelerating the science, on addressing health disparities, on building healthcare sustainability. You know, these are impact investments, they're contributions, they are collaborations, but the ability to demonstrate progress through strategic collaborations like those can be another way to validate the progress and the ESG footprint.
Thank you so much. Alicia, do you know whether we have any further questions come through at all?
I think you've done a sterling job of covering pretty much all of them. So yeah, I think just with that, it's now time for me to sort of just bring the discussion to a close. And firstly, to thank Holly, Claire, Lindsay, Alice, Paul, Jason for your time. I think you've really firstly highlighted why ESG is important, so why it matters. What it looks like, so what it means to you. And I think our sector certainly is ahead in terms of demonstrating that. Perhaps there's still discussions to have around how it's assessed and maybe the role of different sized organizations and biotechs in adopting that. So lots to take out, and also thank you to all the attendees who joined, and those who you've stuck with us to the end, which is brilliant to see. So I will follow up with a follow-up email that will have a link to the recording and also to upcoming events that One Nucleus is holding. And just to mention, of course, our On Helix conference is coming up in a month's time. So that's New Medicines in a Brave New World. So please do check out the keynote program and the innovation workshops that will be going on around that conference. So if you need any further information, don't hesitate to reach out to One Nucleus on that. So just like to say thanks so much, everyone, and I hope you have a good afternoon, evening, or rest of the day, depending on where you are. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.